start this last lecture on this unit kind of the same way we began the unit, which is looking at two different quotes that really kind of summarize the two main conflicting ideologies occurring in the United States in these opening decades of the 1800s, 1810s, 20s, and 30s. And so the first one is by a Massachusetts senator and a strong federalist, someone who kind of promotes national unity, Daniel Webster, who says, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." Right? And if you remember from our previous conversation about these quotes, he's saying that you can't have one without the other. So yes, liberty is important, but we won't have liberty if we're not united, right? Because once we're not united, we'll be fighting with each other, and that will lead to loss of liberty. John C. Calhoun, a counterpart of Daniel Webster during this time, was a senator from South Carolina and at one point a vice president. And he says the union, next to our liberty, most dear, right? So the union is very important, but it's second to our personal liberties and freedoms, right? And so he's saying that unity is not necessarily essential in trying to promote our liberty, right? And so these are two conflicting thoughts, right? What should be valued more, unity or personal choices and states' rights? Right? And so this sectionalism really comes to the forefront yet again with these protective tariffs that we've been talking about, right? We mentioned these protective tariffs under the American system, which benefited the northern economy because it helped kind of make northern goods more competitive in the market. But it does not do much good for the Southerners because Southerners now have to pay more for the products they used to get for free, right? Because they weren't the ones developing these products. They don't need that incentive. They wanted a cheaper consumer goods, which the tariffs do not actually do. And so these tariffs were increased over time in 1816, 1824, and again in 1828. Excuse me. The tariff of 1828 is kind of the boiling point, so to speak, for these Southern states' rights advocates. And many people, including John C. Calhoun, calls the Tariff of 1828 the Tariff of Abominations, right? It's an abomination. It's disgusting. It's terrible. It's a complete violation of Southern rights, right? And so in response to these things happening, these rises in tariffs and other issues, John C. Calhoun comes up with a nullification theory. And so we've looked at the term nullification before, and that was earlier on in the year, and chronologically in American history, when Jefferson wrote a nullification resolution, right, for Kentucky, saying that pretty much states have the right to nullify or void certain things, certain unconstitutional acts made by the federal government, right? And so that was formulated by Jefferson and other people earlier on the very beginning of the 1800s. But it's not really fully formulated and really used in full practice until Calhoun and South Carolina and this nullification theory. So the one passed in Kentucky was a resolution. It was saying they had the right to do this, but it wasn't actually anything binding. It wasn't like they were refusing to actually follow the law. This case is going to be a little different. So again, John C. Calhoun is a statesman, a senator, vice president at one point from South Carolina, and throughout his career, he goes from kind of being a strong nationalist leader, right, one who wants to promote nationalism. Remember, he was one of the supporters of the American system with Henry Clay, to someone who then becomes increasingly focused on the rights of South Carolinians. After all, he was a senator from South Carolina, and people started saying, well, he's not really caring about what we want because he's promoting all these nationalist ideas. What about us here in South Carolina? And so over time, he actually changes to be very strongly pro-states' rights. Right, and his theory states that the Constitution was a compact or an agreement made by several different sovereign or independent states, right, the 13 original states. So since if a state believed a law was unconstitutional, then they had a right to nullify it or reject that law, since they were the ones that gave meaning to the Constitution by agreeing to it. They had the power then to say, well, you can't do this as well, right, since it was a compact, an agreement. And if they feel that that agreement was broken or that compact was broken, states have a right to not follow that aspect of the law. Right? And his theory was that this was meant to protect the interests of the minority from being dominated by the majority. Right? So there are certain interests by the minority that in a pure democracy could be kind of taken advantage of. So then they also said that if a federal government, this is kind of where it goes one step further here than the original nullification resolutions in Kentucky. And he says that if the national government refuses to let a state nullify a law, so they send in force, or they say, no, you can't do this, that state has a right to withdraw from that compact they made, right? They have a right to withdraw from the union. In other words, they have a right to secede from the union. And the idea of secession is really important because that's going to come up from the Civil War, right? This is kind of the theory that serves as the framework and the groundwork, the foundation for states seceding from the Union and starting the Civil War. So John C. Calhoun's theories are really important because they do have a major impact, and they kind of gave a legal and political justification for their actions a couple of decades later. Right, so this crisis point then, he is 1832. So in 1828, you have Calhoun calling that tariff the tariff of abominations. And then a couple years later, in 1832, that tariff rises again. And so this is now completely unacceptable to the South Carolinians in particular. And so the South Carolina legislature votes to nullify the tariff, meaning they're not going to follow it. They're not going to pay it. They refuse to support it. Right? And this is a direct challenge to the federal government. And President Jackson, who's an interesting man because he, in some aspects, supports states' rights and the rights of individuals and doesn't want too strong of a federal government. And we're going to see that with the national bank in a few slides. But on the other hand, he does not like his own power being questioned, right? And he ultimately does believe, regardless of what he believes about states' rights, he does believe that the federal government should be supreme, that this country should stay united, right? He kind of falls onto Daniel Webster's side that both union and liberty are inseparable. So he actually prepares to send troops into the state. He has an army ready to march into South Carolina because he sees this as kind of an insurrection, as treason against the federal government. To avoid this kind of something turning into a full-blown civil war, Henry Clay, that great compromiser, steps in and makes another compromise. So he gets people to agree that these tariff levels would decrease over a 10-year period. So they're going to start off where they are, and then every couple of years they'll go down. Kind of a gradual way to make sure the northern interests are protected with their industry being protected, and also the southern, there's a kind of light at the end of the tunnel for those southern states that they'll eventually have more affordable products again. So it's almost a crisis point. It is a crisis point, almost a civil war. And again, this really strongly highlights that sectionalist tension that's ultimately going to lead to the Civil War, right? Because South Carolina is the first state to secede from the Union in 1860, right? So you have this state of South Carolina as kind of the leader of this nullification theory, the secession theory, and states' rights. Right? But then going back to Andrew Jackson, who's the president during this time, and again, really interesting man because he is prepared to send federal troops in to keep the country together, right, and make sure that a state is doing what it's following the federal law. But on the other hand, he's also against the national bank and this aspect of kind of strengthening the national government, right? He in 1832 he vetoes the rechartering of the national bank. And just to remind us what a veto is, when a law is passed by Congress, the president has the right to veto it or prevent it from happening, which then can be overridden by Congress with a 2/3 vote. But anyway, so he vetoes this rechartering of the national bank, which means that the national bank ceases to exist. The reason he does this is because Jackson and his supporters, which are called Jacksonians, believe that the Bank of the United States had an unfair advantage over state and private banks. Right? So again, you have this idea that here's a guy ready to send troops in to keep South Carolina in line, but now also doesn't want a national entity like the Bank of the United States having an unfair advantage over states. So he's a very interesting man in this idea of states versus federal power. So his veto is successful. They're not able to override it, and he prevents the national bank from being rechartered. So this is the second Bank of the United States, and it expires in 1832, and that's that. There's no more national bank at this time. Right? Many people don't like this, right? Because this is a very controversial issue. And so at this time, you actually have a new political party that forms. Because by this point, by the time of Jackson, the Federalists kind of ceased to exist. They're no longer a major political party. The Democratic Republicans, which Jackson was a Democrat Republican, kind of is almost like the sole party. You might have individual opposition, but there's not really an organized opposition until the formation of this Whig Party, which forms around the time Jackson's president. And they kind of are a reaction to Jackson. So they supported the American system of Henry Clay, right? So this nation-building system. They supported a national currency, that there shouldn't be different paper money based on different states. And they supported a national bank. Again, national bank and national currency closely related to each other. And the lack of a national bank actually leads to an economic disaster. Um, so in 1837, at this point now, there's a couple of years without any 1832s when the Bank of the United States is kind of expires. So for a couple of years now, 5 years, you have no national bank, but you have dozens of private banks. And each of these banks has their own paper notes that they're issuing. So if you have money in Chase, for example, you had, say, I don't know, $10 worth of gold in Chase, they could give you a Chase bill that said it's good for $10, right? However, what starts happening is that private banks begin issuing these notes when they actually don't have the gold to back it up, right? So, if you go to the bank, there's not like there's actually all your money is not actually sitting in that one bank, right? They use that money to invest, to trade, to make money themselves. And so they start giving out paper notes for gold that they can't actually support, right? And the federal government under President Jackson starts recognizing this and says this is a problem. And so when dealing with purchasing of public lands, which is actually a lot of that happening at this time, because as more and more people move west, that land they're buying in these territories is federal land, right? And so a lot of this land they're buying, Jackson wants to make sure it's not being bought with worthless paper money, right? That has no gold backing. And so he directs the government to only accept specie, right? Which is physical gold and silver, the actual gold or silver coins for purchase of public lands. And that's concerning for a lot of people because a lot of people don't actually have that gold in front of them. They have these banknotes. And so people, what we call a run on the bank, people rush to the banks to start trading in these paper notes for the value that they have in gold. But we just mentioned that a lot of these banks don't actually have all that gold present with them. And so when they don't have enough gold and everyone starts taking out, now these banks are bankrupt. They have no money and they're forced to close. Right? And when they're forced to close, this is before you have what we call insurance on bank money. And so if a bank closed and you had money in it, now you lost all your money. So many people lose their life savings. Everything they ever saved up is gone. And there's no way for them to get it back. And when that's what's happening, when there's no gold available, credit dries up as well. Banks have to become more conservative. They can't just give out credit and investments. And so there's less investment money around for people to buy, to start businesses or do things like that, buy land. And so an economic depression occurs in 1837. Pretty bad one. A lot of people, lose their jobs, banks close, people have no money, they're starving, factories close up. It's classic signs of an economic depression. This is what causes President Van Buren to establish a federal treasury to help control the gold supply. And this federal treasury still exists today. And it's a way to make sure that you don't have another issue where there's all these paper notes with no gold backing. Right? And so the economic crisis of the time, at this point, Jackson ran 2 terms and then was done. So his successor was Martin Van Buren. Actually loses the next election in 1840. And he's defeated by a man named President Harrison. Tippecanoe Harrison, that was his nickname, Tippecanoe, because he was a general who fought, if I'm not mistaken, he fought in the Native American kind of wars. So Tippecanoe was he was named for that because it was one of the battles he fought in. So Tippecanoe Harrison. And his vice president was a man named John Tyler. President Harrison is kind of famous. William Tippecanoe Harrison is famous because he was elected, and 30 days later he dies. The shortest presidency in our country's history. He's believed to have caught pneumonia from his inauguration day. And so his vice president then, this is what was set up, how it was set up, the vice president becomes president. But he must have been kind of just a Whig in name only, and he ends up opposing many Whig proposals. And so people began calling him his accidency, right? So he was kind of accidentally brought into the presidency. He was an accident, a mistake of a choice to pick because he was not truly a Whig. And so the Whig efforts for national unity kind of come up short during this time period. Right? And so all this is setting that stage for that sectional difference, right, which is only going to worsen as we move on. And as the next unit we talk about is Western migration, this debate about slaves and free states is only going to continue, and it's ultimately going to boil over into the Civil War, which happens just 20 years after this election of 1840.